welcome to The Explainer. All right, today we are diving deep into a huge theological shift, one that's right at the core of the Christian faith.
And it all centers on this one big question. Why did the Old Covenant, the original agreement between God and his people, get canceled and totally replaced? And we're not talking about some minor software update here. This was a complete system overhaul. So let's get into the reasons laid out in the sermon we're looking at.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this massive change, we've got to go right to the source, where the Bible itself announces this brand new thing called the New Covenant. So much of this argument really hinges on this one verse from the book of Hebrews. It says, and this is key, by calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete and ready to disappear. The speaker we're analyzing really stresses this point. This isn't some subtle hint. It's a loud and clear announcement that a replacement is happening. I mean, just think about the power packed into that one little word, new. The speaker makes a great point here. The second God introduces something as new, it automatically makes everything that came before old. It's instantly worn out, obsolete, and, well, on its way out the door. The change was literally baked right into the language itself.
Right, so that brings us to the million-dollar question. Why? I mean, if the first covenant came from God, why on earth would it need to be replaced? It's a fair question. Let's dig into the reasons the sermon gives us. And the source material frames the whole issue with this really simple, logical question. Think about it. If the first covenant had been completely flawless, would there have been any need for a second one? Of course not. The very fact that a new one was introduced tells you that something about the original just wasn't working. And here is the absolute key distinction that the sermon makes. The fault wasn't with the law. No way. The law itself was considered holy and good. The problem, the fault God found, was with the people. It was with our inability as human beings to actually follow it perfectly. So what exactly were these so-called flaws? Well, the source breaks it down into 5 key problems with the Old Covenant. 5 reasons it just couldn't last. All right, here's the list. First up, it was seen as working against people, not for them. Second, its glory was kind of fading. Third, it was pretty much impossible to keep perfectly. Fourth, you had this mismatch, a spiritual law for, well, not so spiritual people. And last but not least, the whole thing depended on flawed human judges. Let's unpack these one by one. Okay, first, this idea that the law was against us. Imagine a rule book with hundreds of rules. And if you break even one of them, just one, you're under a curse. That's what the Old Covenant was like. So, according to the interpretation of Colossians presented here, the law ended up feeling less like a helpful guide and more like an enemy, a written code that was always there to prove you failed. Now, this brings us to the second point, and you can really see the difference here. The Old Covenant, yeah, it had glory. It was from God, but it's described as a fading glory. It was temporary. The New Covenant, on the other hand, that's a whole other level. It's described as having a surpassing, permanent glory. We're talking about a massive upgrade. Then there's the third problem, which is basically a fundamental mismatch. The sermon points to the book of Romans, which argues the law is spiritual, but people, well, we're not. We're carnal or worldly. It's like trying to run the latest, most advanced operating system on a computer from 1995. The hardware just can't handle the software. It was a setup for failure from the start. And that brings us to the final and maybe most practical flaw. The whole system was built on a shaky foundation. This quote from Hebrews really hits the nail on the head. The law appointed men in all their weakness to be high priests. Think about that. You have imperfect, flawed human beings trying to enforce a perfect divine law. That model just wasn't built to last. So let's recap the problem. You've got an external, punishing law that's basically impossible for flawed humans to follow. So what's the fix? Well, this is where the New Covenant comes in, and it's not just a tweak, it's a complete, radical redesign of the whole system. And you can really see the side-by-side comparison here. Everything gets flipped. The law goes from being external, carved on stone tablets, to being internal, written right on our hearts and minds. We go from needing human priests to having Christ as the high priest. The whole system of curses and animal sacrifices gets replaced with a direct line to God. And maybe most importantly, you go from flawed human judges to God himself being the judge. So what does that even mean, to have the law written on your heart? Well, the way the sermon explains it, it's basically like having an internal moral compass installed. You're not constantly having to check an external rulebook anymore. Instead, the idea is that you have this innate, God-given sense of right and wrong inside you. And the implications of this internal system are just huge. The speaker points out that it means everyone, from the least to the greatest, can have a direct knowledge of God. You don't need a middleman anymore, no priest or teacher to say, hey, here's what God wants. The idea is that your own heart and mind can figure it out. And this is a game changer. It means other people can't be your ultimate judge anymore. This all leads to a pretty radical conclusion, and it's based on this line from Romans: where there is no law, there is no transgression. The logic is pretty straightforward. If that old rulebook, with all its specific regulations about food and festivals and so on, if that's gone, then, well, you can't technically break those rules anymore. Breaking them is no longer a transgression. All right, let's wrap this up and boil it all down to the main takeaway from this whole explanation. So if you only take one thing away from this, let it be this. The whole shift is from out there to in here. It's a move away from external rules enforced by imperfect people to an internal guidance system judged by God Himself. That's the core of it. And so the source material leaves us with this really powerful, thought-provoking question. If the law isn't a checklist in a book anymore, but instead it's this internal guide on our hearts, then what does that actually mean for how we figure out right from wrong today? I mean, as individuals, as a community, it's a question that has some seriously massive implications.